Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Robb Young, and I'm the Global Markets Editor for the Business of Fashion. So although I'm based in London, I actually travel all the time. I don't really have a home. Over the years, one of my specialties has become emerging and frontier markets. China, India, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and the former Soviet countries, they've all had their moment in the spotlight, and their fashion scenes are all evolving fast. But the future, we're told, is Africa. African alliances. For those of us lucky enough to have traveled around the continent, there's no need to explain why Africa is so exciting. From a nightclub in Nigeria to street style in Senegal, you can simply feel it in the air. But most people working in fashion haven't had the opportunity to explore it yet, so Africa is left to our imagination. Indulge me for a moment and let's imagine Africa. Let's imagine an Africa whose designers and entrepreneurs are no longer limited by the familiar obstacles. An Africa with no limits. Let's imagine an Africa with so much wealth that it has more millionaires than the wealthiest of Middle Eastern countries like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Saudi Arabia. Hell, let's imagine it's wealthier than all of those combined. Imagine what an exceptional luxury market that would be for designer fashion. Let's imagine an African online startup that can raise more than $100 million, compete with American giants like Amazon, and sell global fashion brands on a mobile app anywhere on the continent. Let's imagine an African fashion brand that can produce 100,000 pairs of shoes every year, made in Africa, and sell those shoes to shops as far away as China, instead of China selling their shoes to Africa for a change. Let's imagine an Africa with catwalk shows in every major African city and stunning boutiques selling brands like Valentino, McQueen, and even Baby Dior. Imagine. Actually, don't imagine. Because that's not Africa's future fashion potential. That's already Africa's fashion reality. There are more millionaires in Africa than in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Saudi Arabia combined. 165,000 of them, actually. And last year, ordinary Africans bought more than $30 billion worth of branded clothes and shoes. Pan-African companies like Jumia.com, shoe brands like Soul Rebels in Ethiopia, and boutiques like Alara in Nigeria and Luminance in South Africa, they're already laying the foundations for one of the world's most exciting fashion industries. But we all know that fashion is about a lot more than just money, jobs, and labels. It's culture, it's art, it's entertainment, it's creativity, it's part of our identity. Africa, as we lazily call it, is actually 55 diverse countries with over 2,000 languages and some of the fastest growing economies on the planet. 1 billion people, imagine that. Yes, Africa's fashion industry faces the same struggles as anything else on the continent: inequality, poverty, poor infrastructure, conflict, and instability too. It's all true. But it has endless creativity, talent, heritage, and entrepreneurial spirit. African fashion isn't the future, it's now. So in my humble opinion, now is the time for all of us to consider how we can forge collaborations, partnerships, and alliances on this extraordinary continent. But I know that it's not always easy to see how to start a dialogue with a market as complex, challenging, and dynamic as Africa is. So that's why I'm delighted to introduce you to two of the most exciting fashion professionals working in Africa today. Sunny Dolat and Helen Jennings can share their perspectives on how we can all better connect, collaborate, and do business with fashion leaders and entrepreneurs in Africa. Welcome, Sunny and Helen. Thank you. Welcome to you both.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. So, Sunny Dolat is a Kenyan fashion stylist, creative director, and production designer. He's a member of Nest Collective, a multidisciplinary arts collaborative that spans fashion, film, music, and other creative industries. He's also a member of the board and an advisor of HEVA, an East African Catalyst Fund that supports professionals in the creative economy. Helen Jennings is a London-based journalist, consultant, and author of the critically acclaimed book, New African Fashion. She is also the founder of Natal.com, a new editorial platform celebrating contemporary African fashion, arts, and culture. Through her role as former editor of Arise magazine, Helen presented Pan-African fashion through the media and catwalk events in New York, Paris, and London. You'll notice that we're missing one of our panelists. Omuyemi Akarele is the founder of Lagos Fashion and Design Week in Nigeria. Unfortunately, due to a family emergency, she couldn't be with us today. Thank you both for coming all this way to talk about African fashion alliances.
Thank you.
Sunny, tell us a bit about the Nest Collective. What is it? The motivations behind it? I read somewhere a segue of your manifesto, subverting the layers of Africans, how they're seen and unseen. Sounds fascinating. How does that play out in a city like Nairobi?
Well, so the Nest Collective is a multidisciplinary arts collective. We're a group of 10, and we do work primarily in film, fashion, photography, and music. We are about 4 years old, and kind of like the motivation behind our work has always been to commentary, subversion, among many other things. In terms of how Africans are seen and unseen, I think we always find that there's how we as Africans, and in this sense, I'd just like to say that like saying African can sometimes be very complex because of, it's 55 countries. And sometimes there's, not even sometimes, but quite often there's, like I'm not necessarily in touch with what's happening in Niger, for instance. But yeah, that's just a little disclaimer.
So let's pick up on this topic of subversion for a moment, because I think in the many expectations that people have outside of Africa of African fashion, that's probably not the first thing that comes to mind, subverting the fashion system.
Yeah. I think, well, for one, we find that, especially with fashion, there's always kind of like an expectation of what African fashion looks like. And that's a thing that we're trying to challenge. A lot of times you always hear things like, and I think Helen will tell you, things that like African fashion is very colorful, very print-focused. And there's kind of, like in Nairobi, for instance, there's an emerging aesthetic that's very unlike what we've seen before on the continent and in the country. And so it's kind of, almost kind of just like the existence of that is in a sense a subversion. And we're really interested in that and kind of having conversations around that. Yeah.
So it's about challenging people's preconceived notions of design, for one thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That leads me to Helen, actually, because when you wrote New African Fashion, it was 4 years ago, it was a different landscape. There wasn't really the same attention on Africa, either as a source of inspiration or as a market to sell to or manufacture in. So there was obviously a need for this book, but what were your personal motivations behind the book, besides just wanting to fill a really interesting gap?
It was along the same lines of what Sunny's saying, really. I'd been editor of Arise for about 3 years at that point. I'd traveled all over the continent. I'd met all these amazing talents across music, fashion, art. Everything was going on and no one seemed to know much about it. Arise had been well received. People were interested.
Arise is based in Nigeria, wasn't it? It was a Nigerian
It was
tycoon.
Nigeria owned, but we were in London. and the Africa Rising narrative was starting, and it just seemed like the right time. So I looked around, and there were no books that had been really done on the subject. There was very ethnographic books, textile books, but nothing that was really focusing on the now generation. So I got around writing it, and it went down quite well.
Okay.
And it was exactly that same message. You know, there were some designers who were, you know, quite Afrocentric, some very minimalist and deconstructed, and was putting them all together and putting them out there so they could get some more attention in the global market.
So what were the things that people were surprised the most about from the book, the conclusions you made, or the expanse of the diversity of the designers that you had? Was it, again, design-focused? People were quite focused on the fact that there was so much variety in terms of design, or were they interested more in the geographic scope? Or?
I think the diversity and the variety, and it also covered photography, models, some other industry topics, how African designers have influenced international trends. It was across the board, talking about photography from, you know, the post-colonial era and how that's coming back in. It was like a very broad overview, and it, you know, it can't tell the whole story. It's one book, but I think people were just so surprised there was that much going on, and I think it did help some individual designers get to the next level as well.
Okay. Sunny, I'd like to return to this idea of disruption again. Sorry, I didn't get enough the first time around. You talk about making unapologetic statements and disrupting the system a bit. And of course, that's a buzzword that we all hear nowadays. But how does that take on a unique manifestation in Africa? Or are you just applying these same kind of rebellious outsiders looking in perspective that so many people are doing now?
Well, I'd like to give you an example of the fashion industry in Kenya and how it operates. For a long time, fashion has been one of those industries that a lot of people have considered fluff. It's like, yeah, it's great. It's all about like clothes and like all of these things. And so that's positioned the industry in a very weird place whereby the corporate world call on fashion when it's convenient. So like a random bank will have like a horse race, for instance, and then right at the end of the day, they'll plug in a little fashion show that no one necessarily pays attention to, and like, you know, it's just like a little 15-minute slot that is given at the end of the day. And so that's had a very kind of negative impact on the industry. And so fashion shows, for instance, are a thing that aren't necessarily very useful back home because they're very...
Youthful, you said?
Useful, yeah. Useful. Because, for one, you don't necessarily get in international buyers. There isn't great press around it. Mm-hmm. And so for any young designer, taking part in a fashion show is, one, very expensive, and two, not very useful. And so one of the things that we did as a collective is 3 years ago, we kind of sat down and we were like, you know, so fashion shows clearly don't work and are, you know, quite expensive. What other ways are there to still showcase fashion, have a lot more control, and possibly reach more people?
Right.
And that's when we did our first fashion film project called Chikoleko Presents, where we picked out 8 young designers and made 8 films in a day, and then just put them out, put them on YouTube, and kind of learned from that. And that was a very interesting process for us because, first of all, there's that whole aspect of videos going viral, and that's really quite something. I think at some point we started getting emails from Antigua, and we're like, okay, so that's interesting.
Right.
And so that in itself, the films really did disrupt the industry, whereby now you had designers asking questions. They're like, okay, so now fashion film is definitely an option to consider. So at least, whereas before people only had fashion shows, now you're having a lot more people doing fashion films because they're able to choose between shows and film. And I think that's a good thing.
So was it more about kind of challenging the power structure that existed within Kenya and the fashion scene as it was kind of forming?
Absolutely. One of the things that like we're all about really like deconstructing power structures and like rearranging power dynamics and all of that. And we're really interested in giving designers a lot more power and control. Because again, back home, with shows, a lot of the power lies with the event organizers. And they're the ones who tell designers that, hey, to take part in this show, you're going to have to pay €1,000 in participation fee. And we don't feel like that's right. And so we're doing all these kind of like little projects and research to find ways to kind of like shift power and like shake things up a little bit.
I think you've done quite a good job because there's a vacuum now in Kenya, isn't there? There's no fashion week at all of a sudden.
There's no fashion week, yeah.
Helen, when you were editor at Arise magazine, you were already talking about a new era for African fashion that doesn't depend on cliches, that can challenge people's expectations. We touched on this a little bit already, but looking at things from your perspective as a British woman, exploring the continent and trying to promote this perspective, working with African designers, how was that, being an outsider and then moving in?
Well, in ways it was an advantage because we gave it a very global approach. We weren't, held to a region or any internal politics of any part of the continent. So we took a very global approach in the editorial pages. So we profile African designers in the diaspora, African American, and other, just any international brands. And we'd talk about them in the same way, in the same sort of contemporary, fresh editorial voice. So it wasn't like, oh, here's French fashion over here and here's African fashion over here. We put it all together in one melting pot. I think that was quite new at the time. And then we also did fashion shows. So we did presentations in Paris, Johannesburg, London. We did 4 or 5 seasons on schedule at New York Fashion Week, which was great fun. We had Alucci and Alec Weck, and we had Grace Jones walk the catwalk, so they were great for column inches. And then we did 2 fashion weeks in Lagos as well, which were Pan-African. And we didn't charge the designers. So yeah, it made good noise. It got people press, got the conversation going.
So obviously, what you want to do is present any region on the same platform as the rest of the world, but it's a tricky situation because even the very existence of this panel brings up the question, are we dedicating the space to Africa? Why? So it's quite difficult sometimes to dedicate a space or have a confinement around a particular scope. Did you find that sometimes in your work that people challenged you in that way?
A little bit. It's a double-edged sword, because you want people to know about it, but you also don't want to put talent in a box or define it in any way. So, yeah, always slightly conflicted in that way. But
Sunny, what's your take when you first got this invitation from me? Did you think, oh God, not another Africa thing? Well, what was your immediate reaction?
No, I think my immediate reaction was
be honest. Not too honest.
Well, like I remember when you sent like the list of questions to go through. There were definitely some really fantastic. Actually, all the questions were really fantastic and really covered kind of like all the issues and everything that's happening on the continent at the moment. I think for me, my concern usually is, say for example, if you have like New York Fashion Week, which is, like a big deal. And then you find that a few days after you have like Africa Fashion Week New York, which isn't necessarily plugged into the main Fashion Week and doesn't really get the same press. So for me, that's always kind of like a concern. I always feel like, it'd be great to be able to have African designers as part of the main New York Fashion Week. It's kind of like the same thing of like having a fashion show and then having a separate fashion show for young designers. I feel like the young designers should be a part of the, they should be a part of the main show. So it's kind of, yeah.
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it?
It is.
In Kenya, there's a lot of attention on the fabrics like kikoi and kanga and the like. And if people know anything about fashion in Kenya or East Africa, it's that kind of thing. So how do you tell people from the outside, we embrace your interest in these kind of things, but we want you to explore more?
Yeah. I think kind of the thing that comes with international interest is that, so first of all, unfortunately, Kenya doesn't have a very rich textile history as opposed to other countries on the continent. And so the few that we do have, which are kanga, which we share with Tanzania, and then there's kikoi as well. So first of all, the fabrics themselves, there's definitely limitations as to how they work. If you take kanga, for instance, because it's so light, it's not necessarily the best to work with. So you'll make a really beautiful blouse made, and it will last maybe 4 months if you're lucky.
Small problem.
And so in that respect, there's definitely a gap in terms of innovation around the fabrics that exist. Honestly, I'd love to be able to see someone coming in and being able to push kanga and kind of rework it and make it more durable and longer lasting. If you take an example of a brand like Lalesso, for instance, who take the template of a kanga and have been able to work it into and to make swimwear and all of these things, and that's, I think, really great. In terms of working with the fabrics, I think, again, this kind of goes back to what I said earlier, whereby for outsiders coming into the country, you come in with all these kind of preconceived ideas about what Kenyan fashion looks like. And so you come in and you're looking for kanga and you're looking for kikoi. And then there's, of course, all the information that we have on the ground, which is stuff that kanga isn't necessarily great for working with.
Right.
And so sometimes there's kind of a disappointment. I remember I once went for a fashion show with this Italian guy, and he was very disappointed at the end of the show. And he was like, I don't understand why everyone was just kind of working in black, everything is so sleek. And I was like, we like black too. And in Nairobi, there's a very minimalist sensibility that's emerging. You're finding designers who are working almost exclusively in neutrals. And I mean, there's definitely a lot of theories as to why that's happening. Some people feel like it's that kind of restraint is something that we picked up from the British. There's a retailer who was saying that every time in his store, the men's clothing, he only sells black, white, gray, and navy. So there's all of these things whereby there's all the preconceived ideas, and then you come into the country and you realize that it's completely different.
So it's as simple as coming with an open mind.
Yes.
Really?
Yeah.
I see. So back to Helen. Of all the different designers that you've chronicled, from your time at Arise to covering the book and your work since at Natal, which of the designers do you think are worth the international attention, and why? If you can pinpoint a few of them. Because, I mean, it's very important for us to have a few key references and to know, there's a lot of designers who may not rise to the top and some that aren't globally relevant. How do you make that distinction, and who should we know?
I wanted to just quickly mention 3. The first one is called Makio. She's based in Lagos. I'm head to toe Makio today, free advert. She actually trained in the UK, launched her label in Lagos in 2010. She focuses on reinventing local textiles, mainly adire, which is a Yoruba resist-dyed indigo fabric, she does her own versions of it. And then also looks at ashioki, which is a woven fabric, and sort of pulls it apart and reconstructs it. And then her silhouettes are, they're quite anyone could wear them. They're very contemporary and feminine and sensual. And she's just gone from strength to strength. So last year she was shortlisted for the LVMH prize. Michelle Obama's worn her. Solange is a big fan. She's stocked in the US, and I think she's definitely going to go very far. Duralulu supports her a lot as well. Another one is a lady called Loza Maliombo. So she's based in Abidjan. She's very strong
Côte d'Ivoire.
in Côte d'Ivoire, and she's very good on very strong feminine tailoring. She uses local fabrics that she sources. That could be kente, or it could be wax prints. And she takes inspiration from, it could be a masquerade dance or, strong family members, and she turns that into something very fresh and new. And again, she's getting a lot of press. She's shown in Paris, in New York. And she's amazing on Instagram, so follow her. And the last one is La Duma, Max Ossa by La Duma, who's based out of Cape Town. And he specializes in knitwear. So he got going because he saw in his culture, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but Hossa culture, the men get knitwear when they go through their initiation ceremonies, and it's always international, it's Pringle or whatever. So he developed his own take on that knitwear based on beading and local patterns. And he's now studying at St. Martin's. He was at Pitti. He's a Vogue Talent competition that he won. So yeah, they're my 3 picks.
Oh, good tips. That brings me to sort of the last area that I wanted to cover, really. We understand quite clearly that Africa is a wonderful source of inspiration and of design talent now. It's evolving. But there's the other side of the equation, and there's fashion as commerce the other direction. We have people from international markets that are increasingly interested in Africa for different reasons, as a source of affordable manufacturing, of specialized skills in the manufacturing sector, and as a market to sell international labels and fashion as well. So we've had people like Vivienne Westwood, Stella McCartney. They've all dabbled in different parts of Africa, doing different initiatives. H&M and Guess, they produce a range or a few products on the continent now. So how do we take some lessons from these? How do we make the communication lines stronger, and how do we make these alliances happen in a more meaningful and regular way? These kind of partnerships, they're not always ideal. There are some aspects that probably we might be critical of that are maybe not the best, or there's some areas they could improve. Do you have any thoughts on those from the different collaborations I mentioned, or any others that you know about? Either of you?
I think you have to be in it for the long term. I see a lot of these initiatives that are, it's one season or it's 2 seasons, and they make a lot of noise, and they probably spend more on the marketing than they did on the product. Mm-hmm. And then it's gone, so that doesn't really do anyone any good. What happened to them, people working for them on the ground? So that's one thing. And also just getting the right local partners. I mean, there's great industries happening all over the continent, especially in the major cities. Plug into that, find those people, take your time. Don't come in thinking you're providing the answer. They're providing you the answer. So I think that's really important. And also always keep the sustainability angle at heart, because it could go horribly wrong if you don't.
Sunny, any thoughts? Final thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree with Helen in terms of like a lot of these things we usually see are always for a season. And I think definitely some longer lasting relationships are a thing that would be great. I think the thing that we're kind of looking at now is there's a lot of production that's about to start happening, that actually has started happening on the continent. And so there's a few concerns in terms of many concerns with larger production units setting up. We're looking at because of course people want to get stuff produced for as little as possible. So there's a little like nervousness around that, that there will be a lot of exploitation. And so I think the thing is to try and figure out a way to to curb that before it happens. Yeah.
To be mutually beneficial and a
Yeah.
bit more fair.
Yeah, definitely.
Understood. Well, it seems like we're running out of time.
Yeah.
So before I conclude, I just wanted to mention the fact that I think that you don't need to be a maverick or a pioneer to get involved with Africa anymore, no matter what aspect of the fashion business you're in. There are always ways to make contacts and connections and nurture relationships that are meaningful. And for those people who don't start doing so now, it's only going to be a matter of time before they have to. So if there's any message I hope you've taken from that, from today, it's that message. And let's stop imagining and let's start collaborating more. Thank you very much. Thank you.